Islamic history, the year 627, Battle of the Trench Part 4, the Siege of the Banu Qurayza. In a previous history episode, I talked about the parallel between Jewish-Muslim relations of Muhammad's time and Jewish-Muslim relations in our time, with the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but only with these situations basically reversed. Now, this parallel certainly existed in the build-up to the Battle of the Trench. See previous episodes for that. I talked about this extensively. But the same parallel can be used after the battle. You can really do the same thing for the battle's aftermath as well. Only this time, we're coming even closer to our own age. But once again, with the Muslims in a place similar to the modern state of Israel. And what I mean by closer to our own age is basically the 21st century, as opposed to the history from the 40s to the 60s. Because the pre-Battle of the Trench Muslim community situation was what we talked about. It was much closer to Israel in its startup days, say 1948 to 1967. And they survived an existential battle with stunning success. And once the Quraysh and the Allied armies left Medina in 627, the Muslim community transitioned into a new era, a more powerful era. You might see where I'm going with this. It starts to resemble Israel in the 21st century, a powerful, top-tech military with powerful friends and nuclear weapons, but one still in great danger. There are still plenty of large countries that would love to see Israel disappear. Iran, for sure. Probably plenty of Arab states that still don't recognize it. Then you have the unique position of the Egyptians, not to mention Turkey would love to, in their perfect world, run just straight through Israel on its way to reconquering the Muslim holy cities. And that's not even mentioning the less powerful force next door, or a stubborn force, I think the Israelis might admit, which definitely wants to see every person in Israel dead, and has certainly tried to make that happen on a number of occasions. And in many ways, that seems to be the biggest thorn in the side of the emerging power, this less powerful but more stubborn force. And when you're dealing with something like that, be it Muhammad's community or modern Israel, it's a problem that gets very complex as morality and national security start to intersect in often uncomfortable ways. You really do have to start asking some difficult questions. What do you do with this community of outsiders who, quite probably, they want all your people dead? What are your responsibilities to your own people in that situation? And how do you balance that with your responsibility to act morally to those on the other side of the border, who may possibly be innocent bystanders? That's not a modern thing. That's always been the case. And are they innocent bystanders? How do you make that classification? How do you even define that? What is a moral action towards, say, a 7-year-old who it is certain, it is definite, will be trying to kill you once he's a teenager? These are ugly questions, horrible questions, the kind of things you don't even want to ponder. But these are not questions unique to 21st century Israel, not even close. And Muhammad and the Muslims faced the same set of questions once the Battle of the Trench was over. Because militarily, security-wise, there was a major loose end they needed to tie up. The Banu Qurayza. The strategic vulnerability to the south. the group that could have written a very different history for the Muslims had they not been so wildly indecisive. Now, this isn't exactly like, say, Hamas breaking through a wall and killing thousands of people. That never happened. And you don't have the same multi-generational fury or the explicit stated goal of destroying this larger power. The case against the Banu Qurayza was more theoretical, kind of like the October 7th attacks once were. And that's a hint at what the prevailing argument is going to be here. It's all theoretical. That is, until it's not, and we all die. And the actions of the Banu Qurayza, in theory, could have gotten all the Muslims killed. And it might happen again in the future. So the Muslims have quite a decision on their hands here. The Muslims were now in a powerful position and would start to think, maybe we should just, put this danger down permanently. For the sake of our children and their future children, we can tie up this loose end permanently. We can do it now because we are now powerful. There's no one to stop us. Now, this may sound quite familiar in our times, as does the other side, the Banu Qurayza. What do the Qurayza say? We have no real allies anymore. We are not a threat to anyone, and we are now completely at the mercy of this larger force. And the Banu Qurayza were actually less powerful than the Palestinians are now. There wouldn't be any aid money or NGOs or pleas to larger powers to save them. The Arab alliance was gone. The great powers at the time would never hear of this. They were on their own. And so all they could really do now is lie low and hope for the best. So that's the underlying situation. What actually happened after the Battle of the Trench? What are the actual circumstances all these questions would be evaluated within? Well, the Banu Qurayza didn't come out and attack or anything. And according to the Muslim historians, Muhammad was actually willing to just let this thing go. So the Battle of the Trench was over, the Allied army was gone, and it was time to relax and enjoy the victory. Until the angel Gabriel shows up. This is from the Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith Collection, number 2813. When Allah's messenger returned on the day of the Battle of the Trench, he put down his arms and took a bath. Then Gabriel, whose head was covered with dust, came to him, saying, "You have put down your arms. By Allah, I have not put down my arms yet." Allah's messenger said, "Where to go to now?" And Gabriel said, "This way," pointing towards the tribe of the Banu Qurayza. So Allah's messenger went out towards them. That's the official line. Muhammad was done. He was taking a bath. But God had other ideas. There was a loose end he was being commanded to take care of. So, in the history, Muhammad is indifferent to the Qurayza, but now he was being commanded to lay siege to their fortress. And this is a theme that you will see throughout this event. The historians, whether they are being truthful or not, are always quite careful to portray Muhammad as sort of at least a step removed from the ultimate decision that's being made here. It was not Muhammad's decision to lay siege to the Banu Qurayza. It was God's commandment. And it was not Muhammad who ordered well, you'll see. And you may also see why Muhammad maybe didn't necessarily want his name on this in the first place. So, you don't say no to angels, so the Muslims attacked. And the Qurayza retreated to their castle or fortress or whatever it was. And it looked like they held out for about 25 days. But they couldn't stay there forever, so eventually they knew they were beaten, and they considered their options. Now, there was an ace in the hole available to anyone fighting Muhammad, a unique card that you could play against this uniquely religious army. They could just convert to Islam. But the general attitude seemed to be that if they were to die, they would die as Jews. So, to their credit, in their own minds, betraying God's word did seem worse than death. So they were certainly indecisive, but they were not cowards. Now, on that note, there was an all or nothing, probably suicidal attack that was proposed. They could just storm out of the fortress and just try to take as many of them with you as you can. And maybe that attack could be on the Jewish Sabbath, when the Muslims would not expect it. And it's not crazy. Here's another modern parallel you see here. The Egyptians attacked Israel on the Yom Kippur holiday in 1973. And it worked. They were completely unprepared. Now, the Israelis ultimately won, but this put them on the back foot for a few days at least. Now, it might not surprise you that ultimately the Qurayza just were not that bold, and they decided against this kind of attack, or any attack, be it on the Sabbath or any other time. And I can't help but think that the Qurayza, the people, or at least their leaders, more than anything, simply hated to make decisions. And in the end, quite fittingly, their decision would be to let the enemy make the decision. So they would surrender and accept whatever terms were imposed on them. Now, this seems a bit insane in retrospect, but at the time, there was some sliver of hope, some reason for optimism. They had some options, all of which would, with near certainty, end horribly. They could convert and anger God. They could attack and surely die. They had a really lousy hand, except for one possibility: an old historical link to the Aus tribe of Medina. This was their only card, and they would play it. This would be their only lifeline, and they would try to lean on that rather than engage in some kind of heroic last stand or some other kind of crazy thing. Now, the Aus tribe that we're talking about, AWS, you may remember they were one of the two major warring tribes of Medina, or Yathrib at the time. The Aus were former allies of the Banu Qurayza. Now, while this doesn't mean much to a 21st century American, it meant something in ancient Arabian culture. Just because the formal alliance was gone, the two were still considered to be somewhat linked. And there was also a historical reason for hope, a previous precedent that maybe they think could apply to them. And that was the previous treatment of another Jewish tribe, the Banu Nadir. At least from a certain perspective, this was a hopeful thing, because the Banu Nadir were not slaughtered. They were expelled. Now, there are signs that the Qurayza were hoping for similar treatment, but they were only remembering the first part of the Banu Nadir story. And while doing that, kind of hoping Muhammad would forget the rest of that story. Because yes, the Banu Nadir were expelled rather than slaughtered, but they were also the people who raised the army that had just made the previous battle possible. People who are expelled tend to, if they can, come back to reclaim the land. A certain country in the modern Middle East knows this very, very well. Now, would Muhammad really want to try expulsion again and risk a repeat of all this? Particularly when you are in a position to just take whatever you want. So, after the surrender, The men of the Banu Qurayza were all bound as they awaited their fate. The Aus pleaded for mercy for their old allies, and they were heard. Muhammad would ultimately cede this decision, or so say the histories, to the chief of the Aus tribe. Now, if you're the Banu Qurayza, this was good news. This is what you were hoping for. Muhammad was playing Pontius Pilate rather than seeking revenge. And really, he was the one that they had betrayed, not the Aus tribe. So maybe there was a chance? But there was also some bad news. And that was a guy named Sa'ad ibn Mu'ad. Now, this guy was the chief of the Aus tribe. And he was the person who would be making the ultimate decision. Now, why is that bad news? Well, he had been wounded in the previous battle, which is going to make anybody grumpy. And he wasn't just wounded, he was mortally wounded. He would eventually be considered a battle casualty. So he was free to decide basically whatever he wanted. No matter how angry his tribe was, there would be no consequences. I mean, what could anyone do to him? And so he made his decision. All the men would be killed. Basically, any male of puberty was going to die. The women and children would be enslaved, and all the property would be confiscated and divided among the victors. Now, this decision probably enraged many Aus tribesmen, but at the same time, that anger may have also been tempered by the spoils of the siege, because everyone would be getting something. And it also helped that Muhammad, after the fact, kind of endorsed this. In the Muslim histories, he remarked that this decision certainly came from heaven. And Muhammad himself took one of the enslaved women as his prize, making her his latest wife. Her name was Rayhana bint Zayd. So all of the bound men learned their fate. Estimates range from 600 to 900 people among the condemned. And here's where the second trench in the Battle of the Trench comes in. The first trench was to prep a battlefield for defensive purposes. And the second trench would be a mass grave for around 700 people. The first trench was a lifesaver, resulting in just a few casualties in a weeks-long battle. But the second trench would claim about 75 times more lives than the battle which preceded it. So this was going to be ugly. There were no bullets or poison gas or even guillotines. This was something that would have to be done manually, old school. There was no way to separate yourself from the person on the receiving end of this. This isn't a pilot dropping a bomb or launching a missile from 1,000 miles away. This would be up close and personal, and distasteful to just about anybody. And I mean anybody. This is actually a major reason gas chambers became the tool of choice during the Holocaust. It wasn't just efficiency. It was the psychological toll. It was just too much on the SS men conducting mass executions one at a time. Even SS men couldn't handle this. Young men, the cream of the crop, dedicated Nazis, it still managed to get into their souls. And this is relevant because the technique for these executions would actually be somewhat similar with the second trench, similar to the original SS method. You dig a mass grave, kill, kick into the grave, repeat. And I imagine cutting someone's head off is way uglier than shooting them in the head. It's a technique that seemed to rattle even some of the worst people in history. But this aspect of the battle isn't ever really examined. And it's probably because concerns with the very real injuries of post-traumatic stress disorder are a uniquely modern phenomenon. So unsurprisingly, I haven't found anything on the psyche of the men who had to carry this out. Even for ancient people, this was a pretty brutal thing. So, as with many unpleasant things, it was decided that the young men would take care of this. Which, in all fairness, makes sense. Young men don't ruminate much when given an order. They're more likely to just do it than question it. That's why they make great soldiers. And lopping off 700 heads in a day, it also takes a certain amount of physical prowess, particularly if you want it done cleanly. So I suppose there is that practical consideration too. And this horrible process, this did take all day, literally. They were eventually killing people by torchlight. We will get into the morality of all this in the next episode, but I wanted to stress here that this is not merely a morality play. It's a hugely consequential historic event. Morals aside, this siege or massacre or whatever you want to call it, it had massive implications in Muslim history. Yes, the battle was over, and that was huge, but the aftermath of the Second Trench was also a watershed moment in Muslim history for two major reasons. Number one, whether he meant to or not, the dying Aus chief, Sa'ad, he created, or perhaps cemented, a permanent change in Medinan society. He did not rule here as an Aus. He ruled as a Muslim. And that's just how it would be from now on. No more tribes, no more clans, no more piecemeal alliances or other loyalties. There was only one loyalty, Islam. There was one community, Islam. Sa'ad set the societal framework that would allow the Arabs to explode out of the desert as a unified force shortly after Muhammad's death. It was a unity the Arabs had never seen before, and a great deal of that is thanks to Sa'ad and his decision after the Battle of the Trench. The community ties in Medina would have likely been a bit different if Sa'ad hadn't decided to fill that second trench with Qurayza heads. It would have been seen more as a tribal move if he had done that. But he didn't make the tribal move. He made the Muslim move, and that would be the community lens that would be used from now on. And it would be a critical mind frame for what would come next. Not just Muhammad's unification of Arabia, but in the coming Muslim empire and long beyond that. And the second reason this was so consequential is this marked the end of the Jewish presence in Medina. The two other main Jewish tribes of Medina had already been expelled, and this one, well, it was now wiped out, destroyed by a historical pattern that Jews would see over and over again long after this event, and honestly had seen long prior to this event as well. Around a decade after this, the entire region would be religiously cleansed, so I suppose the Qurayza were on borrowed time to begin with. Not that they could have known that, but if they had been a bit more decisive or a bit more enthusiastically allied with Muhammad, the end of the Qurayza story could have been a bit more Fiddler on the Roof than Schindler's List. But their ending was the worst one. The Banu Qurayza were dead, buried in the second trench, as was the millennia-long presence of Jewish communities in the city. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next time. Inshallah.